This is Isaac Newton deliberately blinding himself with a mirror. Not once, multiple times, as an experiment, on purpose. This is the same man your textbook called the greatest scientist who ever lived. Gravity, calculus, the laws of motion. What they didn't mention is that he was also a secret heretic, a part-time executioner, and possibly poisoned himself for 20 years without noticing. So let's actually talk about him. This is the scientist everyone hates. Newton spent his entire life as the most respected scientific mind in England. He also spent his entire life secretly believing the church was fundamentally wrong. Newton privately rejected the idea of the Trinity and saw the worship of Jesus as God as straight-up idolatry, which to him was the worst sin a person could commit. He never said this out loud, not once publicly in his entire life. He hid it so well that scholars are still trying to fully reconstruct what he actually believed centuries later. Picture the most famous physicist alive today, secretly running a private theology blounder, a fake name, for 50 years. That's basically what this was. He kept the pages locked in a drawer in his own desk. Whenever someone knocked, he'd slide them out of sight and pick up an unrelated physics paper instead. Calm as anything, decades of this. A man who spent his public life explaining the universe to everyone else and his private life hiding the one thing he actually believed. And it gets weirder because he didn't stop at theology. Newton ran actual calculations on biblical prophecy to figure out when the world was going to end, and he landed on an answer. Not before the year 2060. That's a real prediction, in his own handwriting, from the man who discovered gravity. He sat down with a Bible in one hand and a sheet of math in the other, treating the end of the world like an engineering problem with a deadline attached. He wrote the number down, closed the book, and moved on like it was a Tuesday. So, somewhere out there is a date on a calculation by Isaac Newton that hasn't happened yet. We'll just leave that there. While publicly doing physics, Newton was privately obsessed with alchemy, trying to turn lead into gold. For decades, he had a hidden lab, vials of mercury, a furnace he'd leaned directly over while testing his own concoctions. And it turns out that obsession may have been quietly poisoning him the entire time. Mercury from these experiments was later found embedded in his own hair. At 50, he had a breakdown, insomnia, paranoid delusions that his friends were plotting against him. He wrote accusatory letters in the middle of the night that he later regretted, sealing them with wax before he could think better of it. Historians think the mercury is the reason. The man who explained how the universe works may not have understood what he was doing to his own brain, one quiet exposure at a time. It wasn't just alchemy. Newton's personal library was stacked with Hermetic and Kabbalistic texts, which he actively studied and annotated as sources of hidden ancient wisdom. By some estimates, he owned more occult material than most professional magicians of his time. He'd sit on the floor surrounded by these books, comparing pages, sketching tiny symbols in the margins with the exact same focus he'd use on a physics equation. To him, there may not have been much difference between the two, just different routes to the same hidden structure underneath everything. If the smartest man in England was secretly this obsessed with the occult, what do you think he was actually looking for? Drop your theory in the comments, we want to hear it. After Newton died, his family found all of this, the heresy, the alchemy, the doomsday math, and panicked. They bundled the papers, tied them with string, and locked them away in a chest, terrified the wrong person would read them and brand him a heretic. They kept it secret for fear it would ruin his legacy. The papers weren't published until the 1960s. That chest sat untouched for almost 2 centuries before it resurfaced at auction, bought and finally read in full for the very first time. Which means the rational genius version of Newton you grew up with wasn't history. It was a clean-up job, curated by his own descendants 200 years after the fact. Even at work, Newton barely tolerated other people. As a professor, his lectures were so unpopular that students simply stopped showing up. So Newton just kept lecturing to an empty room anyway, purely to technically fulfill his contract. No audience, no problem. He'd check his pocket watch, confirm he'd used the required time, and walk out without a second thought. He also lost 2 decades of research in a lab fire and blamed it on his dog, despite people questioning whether he even owned one. Whatever actually happened in that room, Newton's story was, not my fault, blame the dog. And by every account, he never offered a better explanation than that. So why was Newton alone in a dark room, repeatedly blinding himself with sunlight? Because there was nobody around to stop him. He stuttered when speaking to crowds, avoided public speaking his whole life, lost a fortune gambling on a stock bubble, and banned anyone from even saying the company's name near him afterward, and kept his real beliefs hidden behind locked drawers until long after his death. He gave us gravity, calculus, and the laws that explain how the universe holds together. He also got men executed over coin disputes, erased rivals from the historical record out of pure spite, and spent his final years more comfortable with mercury vapor and forbidden texts than with actual people. Brilliant and unbearable weren't two different sides of Isaac Newton. They were the exact same trait, just pointed in different directions. And that's the real story behind the man on your physics textbook cover. Subscribe, because history still has secrets to reveal.